Shall we restart?
Yes, this is a
Yes.
good moment.
Thank you, Alison, for that wonderful introduction. It is really such a great pleasure and an honor to be here to deliver this lecture, but more importantly, to be associated with this exquisite and extraordinary exhibition, World on the Horizon. And if you haven't seen it, it really is a quite remarkable, as you'll see, a remarkable kind of collection of objects from all over the world. My thanks also to Antoinette Burton, to Alison and to Prita Meyer for this invitation, and it's a really great pleasure to be here. Okay, so let's get going, and let's begin with I think one of the great books of the Indian Ocean, Abdul Razak Gurna's novel By the Sea. Okay. The narrative opens in Zanzibar and traces the story of two families feuding over property. The feud is set in motion when a dashing Persian merchant from Bahrain arrives in the monsoon season and seduces the young son of one of the families, while ensnaring the other in a complicated loan using the house of the first family as collateral. So a complicated plot. Also important is a beautiful ebony table which the Persian trader buys as a gift for the young boy he is seducing, and which he purchases with cash and a £20 packet of rare incense from Bangkok. There is, of course, much more in the novel, but I think for our purposes this evening, what is important is that the plot is set in motion from the ocean. The arrival of the Persian trader by sea precipitates the storyline. It is hence a story that comes from the sea. Also important are the objects that arrive from across the ocean, the ebony table, possibly from Ceylon or Makassar, and the incense from Bangkok. The novel is a tale of the seductive and at times destructive power of the stories and objects that come from far away, from across the ocean, or as the title suggests, by the sea, i.e. by means of the sea. Now I start with these themes since they resonate with this exhibition World on the Horizon, which is concerned with objects in the sea, or as the advertising material indicates, the affective power of objects to create networks of affinity across different cultures. As Prita Meyer says in her book, Swahili Port Cities, The Architecture of Elsewhere, and I quote, "Exotic objects fulfilled a desire to possess and amass the materiality of far away. These objects paid tribute to mobility and the ability to make the exotic one's own." She calls these objects relational loci. So objects that they configured different cultural traditions, and such objects could, as she said, they could not be traced back to one place or one society. The Swahili coast asks us to reconsider where Africa, Asia, and Europe begin and end. Now, my talk this evening is intended as a very broad orientation for this remarkable and exquisite exhibition. And I'll attempt to take some of its concerns and explore these in order to give you some sense of the big themes of Indian Ocean history. So what I'm going to do is begin with a shortish section really of Indian Ocean 101 to give you some very basic background, and I hope it's not too basic. And then I'll explore these themes through our 5 objects for this evening: a style of cloth, a shrine, a ship, a book, and a jellyfish. Okay, so let's begin then with our 101 section, and we begin with a figure who will be familiar to all of you, Mark Twain, who in 1896 undertook a world trip. In April of that year, he traveled by steamship, or ocean greyhound as he called them, from Calcutta to Mauritius, which is Mauritius just being to the right of Madagascar. And in his diary, he noted, "We are upon the smooth waters of the Indian Ocean, nothing in sight from horizon to horizon, a cooling breeze. There is no mail to read and answer, no newspapers, no telegrams. If I had my way, I would sail on forever and never go to live on the solid ground again." Now, there is much that one could say about Twain's Indian Ocean travels, but what concerns us this evening is one rather circumstantial detail, namely the cooling breeze that he mentions. Now, while the movement of the steamer would have generated something of a breeze, a vessel traveling southeast at that time of year, April, would have been heading into the monsoon winds, just beginning to blow quietly from the southwest before picking up in intensity a few weeks later. Then 6 to 8 months later, the winds would reverse direction and blow the other way around. Now, the seasonal regime of winds is one of the paramount environmental factors of the Indian Ocean world. The word itself comes from the Arabic, mawsim, meaning season, and the system arises from the fact that the Indian Ocean has a kind of ceiling, i.e., its northern edge is blocked by a massive continental landmass. Land and water deal with heat in different ways, producing patterns of high and low pressure and consequently of wind as well as of rain. So as Edward Elpers indicates in his book, and I quote, "From November through January, pressure builds up over continental Asia and blows dry winds from Arabia and Western India towards Eastern Africa and from China towards Southeast Asia. From April to August, this process is reversed as high pressure zones in the southern hemisphere push strong winds towards the north." Now, the seasonal regime has shaped the rhythm of life around the ocean for millennia, bringing rain to farmers, blowing dhows across the ocean, and enabling trade between the different ecological zones of the Indian Ocean arena. Now, so this monsoon makes the Indian Ocean basin a benign environment for long-distance voyaging, unlike the Atlantic, which is difficult to cross both ways by sail, given that the prevailing winds blow in one direction throughout the year. The Indian Ocean is hence the world's oldest long-distance transoceanic trading arena, which has been crossed for millennia, and it's sometimes known as the cradle of globalization. There is, of course, much of the Indian Ocean that falls outside the monsoon-created world, the monsoon-created region, which you see there as more, as the pink bit. But as we'll see later, the influence of this monsoon-created world reaches well beyond its borders. Now, given that these long millennia of trade and exchange, one key concern of Indian Ocean studies has been a focus on cultural interaction and cosmopolitanism. Port cities around the littoral of the ocean have sustained deep forms of material, intellectual, and cultural exchange, so that denizens of these ports often had more in common with each other than with their fellows inland. This early cosmopolitan world has famously been explored in Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land, which contrasts the rigidity of borders in the 1980s when the book was written with the relative ease of movement in the late medieval Indian Ocean world, a theme explored through the travels of Abram bin Yiju, a 12th century Jewish Tunisian merchant, also a calligrapher and a poet, based in Cairo and then in India. Now, central to these histories of mobility and exchange in the Indian Ocean has been the spread of Islam across land and sea from the 7th century of the Common Era. These religious networks extended and energized the already existing long-distance trading interactions, providing an enabling framework in terms of commerce, shared legal, educational, and spiritual structures, as well as the centrifugal power of the Hajj. By the 14th century, mercantile networks were almost entirely in the hands of Muslim traders. In their wake came scholars, theologians, Sufi divine, Sufism, the mystical version of Islam, being an extremely important strand in Indian Ocean history, and there are traces of Sufism in the exhibition, as you'll see. So Islam in the Indian Ocean arena came to constitute, quote, the largest cultural continuum in the world, as Abdul Sharif has argued in his book on the Indian Ocean. When the Portuguese rounded the Cape in the 15th century, they entered what many have termed a Muslim lake, dominated in the north by the Turkish Ottoman, the Persian Safavid, and the Indian Mughal empires. When the Dutch arrived in the Indian Ocean a bit later, they were able to go from one end of it to another by carrying letters of introduction from Muslim sultans on various shores. Now, as the scholar Eng Seng Ho has indicated, these sprawling networks of Muslim commerce were transacted without the backing of an army or a state. And I quote from him. He says, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English in the Indian Ocean were strange new traders who brought their states with them. They created militarized trading post empires in the Indian Ocean, following Venetian and Genoese precedents in the Mediterranean, and were wont to do business at the point of a gun. While early European entrants to the Indian Ocean world had initially to accommodate themselves to the trading orders that they encountered, by the 19th century, European empires dominated the Indian Ocean arena. With their military, transport, and communication infrastructure, these empires intensified the movement of people across the Indian Ocean world. Much of this mobility was forced and conscripted and involved slaves, indentured laborers, political exiles, and prisoners who were transported between different regions of the Indian Ocean world. At times, these systems built on existing foundations of labor exploitation. So, as some recent research indicates, South Asian indentured laborers, of whom we'll hear a bit more later, were often taken from regions in India where slavery had long existed. So then old and new systems of unfree labor articulated to produce what some have called a carceral archipelago of prisons, plantations, and penal colonies. Now, an archive of such depth and density going back millennia, the Indian Ocean has become an important site for relativizing European-dominated accounts of world history. In such a schema, the age of European empires is but one tiny little sliver in a much bigger arc of history. A view from the Indian Ocean also unsettles notions of European colonizers as purveyors of global grand schemes, as opposed to colonized groups who are often seen as local or parochial. The encounters between Indian Ocean societies and European imperialisms were not simply a case of a globalizing colonizer versus a provincial colonized. Instead, as historians like Eng Seng Ho and Shugata Bose have indicated, the Indian Ocean became an arena of competing universalistic claims. The ambition of British imperialism, for example, were countered by the equally grand visions of Islam. The ancient diffusionism of Hinduism and Buddhism from India into East and Southeast Asia was held up as a benign mode of imperialism that showed up the shortcomings of European colonialism. Indeed, the Indian Ocean arena has produced a very rich repertoire of transoceanic ideologies, be it pan-Islam, Hindu reformism, or pan-Buddhism. Such ideologies inevitably came to carry an anti-imperial inflection, which subsequently fed into ideas of Afro-Asian solidarity and non-alignment arising out of the Bandung Conference in 1955, at which 29 newly independent nations gathered to forge a new path rather than falling in line with either of the rival camps in the emerging Cold War.
Actually, we can stop there. That's
So
where I thought we were going to. Right. Excellent.
Thank Thank you for playing the video on the history of the Indian Ocean world in 5 objects. This video provided us with a fascinating look at how material culture helps us understand the historical connections, trade networks, and cultural exchanges that shape the Indian Ocean world. It offered valuable insights into the broader context of our discussion today. We appreciate your help in sharing this resource. Thank you, Professor Heliason, for your insightful session. We now move on to the tutorial segment where participants can raise their questions and engage in discussions based on the lecture. Or maybe some insights on the YouTube video.
Precisely. Thank you so much.
For those who have questions, please drop them in the chat box. We will address as many as possible.
Exactly. So we can do this very informally and also wrap up earlier if you wish. But I can just comment on this lecture. I mean, it's always wonderful to listen to Isabel, and as you noticed, this lecture repeats several of the points I've been making, and I think I can make two interesting observations. One is precisely the importance of literary writing, of fiction, in making these connections visible to us today. So she brings up there both Gurna and Amitav Ghosh. And the other really important point, and I drew your attention to it in my own lecture as well, is how the Indian Ocean becomes this arena of competing universalistic claims. And I would need to be more of an historian to really be able to judge whether that benign image of the earlier sort of trading network is entirely correct. I couldn't say, but there seems to be much that speaks in its favor. What we do know is that the European colonizers introduced a very violent way of pursuing their aims. Yeah. I suppose a question I would have for you, there's a question coming. I'll address that shortly. The question I would have for you is if there's anyone among you who are working sort of with the Indian Ocean paradigm in your own studies or your own research. So here is, yes, considering the role of the Indian Ocean as a space of cultural and political exchange, how did interactions between Indian and African communities influence early anti-colonial movements in South Africa? Good question. And it's not entirely easy to answer, because at the beginning, as I implied, Gandhi's activism in South Africa was directed very much at sort of at the white government, demanding that Indians be granted the same rights as other whites. But Gandhi was not struggling in solidarity with Africans who were making the same demands, basically. So there was no real sense of there being a common cause between those groups. And a detail that Hofmeyr mentions, a very interesting one, is that Gandhi lived sort of in a rural area not far from Durban, and just a short stretch from there, a very famous African nationalist, John Dewey, had sort of set up his school and worked towards sort of mobilizing Africans in the anti-colonial cause. So the first answer to that question is that there were actually few interactions, and some of those interactions were in fact conflictual. The second answer to that question is that this would change over time. And most significant, and I'll probably be talking about this a bit in my second lecture today, was the rise of Black consciousness in the 1970s in South Africa. And this became a major challenge for the white apartheid government at the time, and represented something new. So the ANC in the 1950s had cultivated a very what they called a multiracial approach, and you had Indians who became prominent and important in the ANC, South African Indians at the time. Interestingly, what happened with Black consciousness was that, and the key figure here is Steve Biko, was that the struggle became defined very much in racial terms, but race became defined as a political construct. So what Black consciousness did was that it provided an inclusive understanding of the term Black, meaning everyone in South Africa that was oppressed by the apartheid laws. In other words, those population groups I mentioned yesterday, coloreds, Asians, Africans. And that really, even more than the ANC's politics in the 1950s, cultivated a strong ties of solidarity between groups in South Africa, and would in turn influence the ANC, and several of the key figures in the early ANC governments from the 1990s and onwards had a South African Indian background. So that would be the longer answer. Okay. Weber has posted a question here. Ocean memories are an essential part of the entire discourse on the environmental humanities. Indian Ocean has been connected to slave trade of its own, similar to the Atlantic slave trade route. Yes, and this is clearly the case. And at the same time, I think one also needs to recognize differences between Indian Ocean slavery and transatlantic slavery. There's overlap, but there are also differences. And I suppose one of the differences is that the definition of slavery in the Indian Ocean context was much broader. So I spoke yesterday about Gorena's novel Paradise and the ways in which he depicts the fate of Yusuf, who becomes a Rahani. So that was one form of slavery, domestic slavery. And I don't know, Viva, if you would like to say anything more about this topic, Indian Ocean slavery. Perhaps not. Okay.
Thank you for that detailed explanation, Professor. We encourage everyone to keep their questions coming.
Yes, precisely. There's one. You discussed the significance of Kilwa potsherds in understanding trade networks. What insights do these artifacts give us about the everyday lives of traders and local populations in places like Kilwa, Mombasa, or Calicut? Yes. Well, this is Hofmeyr discussing them. I don't have any privileged insight into this, I must say. I think the point I wanted to make when I introduced Isabel's work is precisely that she tends to follow the object, and the main object in her case is the book, really, the printed book and the line or periodical, and the ways in which these objects sort of move both in time and space. So that's the very general answer I can give. A more specific answer has to do with well, archaeological findings in Mozambique and I think even Zimbabwe, where one has found fragments of porcelain of China that clearly had arrived on those shores long before the European colonizers. So to actually think, I mean, if I were to retrain as an archaeologist, which I won't be doing, but if I were to do that, I think there's a lot of work that still can be done on sort of uncovering those early histories of the trade networks. So keep thinking about that. I mean, that's something that could really be explored in greater depth. Question from Adil. Can you elaborate on how oceanic approaches provide a different perspective on African history compared to traditional land-based narratives? Yes, certainly. I think it's first of all important to recognize how in the setup of modernity, the territorial nation state has been seen as completely inescapable, as an essential requirement for being and belonging in the world. And as we see from current horrifying conflicts, the Ukraine and Gaza, Palestine, this territorial paradigm has been and remains terribly destructive. While at the same time, there's no one who really is able to see any way out of it. Now, in Africa, in African history, and I can speak mainly about African literary history, and that's my sort of approach to history. It's worth noting differences. So there's certainly much African literature that is not very concerned with the nation state as such, but provides us with accounts of African life. So Things Fall Apart is really one example. It is not a nationalist Nigerian story, but it is African, and African literature has often been understood as this sort of transnational space. But there are other literatures in Africa that have been very national and land-based, such as Angolan and Mozambican literature, especially Angola, where literature has been essential in constructing an imaginary of the territorial nation. Okay, so that's one side of it. What the oceanic approach does is to make visible the connectedness of Africa, and I would say that this is perhaps the main difference. Part of the destructive legacy of colonialism has been to think of Africa as something set apart. It's outside of history. It's outside of modernity. Oceanic approaches show us that no, on the contrary, it's always been a part of the world, and I think that's what Gerna's, Miyakoto's work contributes to. A novel such as Still Life by Wickham also places in this case the Cape in this transoceanic context. So that's what I think we can see is the important point with the oceanic approach. And then there's the whole environmental dimension as well. Yeah, we have more questions here. So could you elaborate on the connection between Gandhi's early activism and broader decolonial movements in Africa? I'm not really the right person to answer that question. What I can say is that there emerged in the 1960s, perhaps it began in the 50s, but especially in the 1960s, a form of what Robert Young has called a tricontinental consciousness, which sort of brought together Africa, Asia, and Latin America into one sort of very, very capacious sort of anti-colonial community. And one writer which has really valued the Afro-Asian connection is the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So it's something that turns up every now and then in his essays and novels. If you read his novel Wizard of the Crow, you will see that India figures there as well. So if you want to explore this more specifically, there's for instance a journal that was published in the 60s called Lotus, and there is quite a lot of work being done on these African Asian connections. Right. And then there's a question here: how did Gandhi's printing press endowment shape public discourse and mobilization among Indian immigrants in South Africa? Well, apparently it did have an impact, and I mean, I would suggest that you read Hoffman's book. There are also other histories of the early sort of anti-colonial movements in South Africa, and Gandhi managed to construct a very sort of high profile, and he was in touch very much with the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, Jan Smuts, and there were important sort of activist manifestations, not least in Johannesburg, that where sort of Gandhi's importance must not be underestimated. So I'm afraid, since Gandhi really isn't I haven't specialized on Gandhi. That's a very general response, but I think that gives you some idea. He was significant, and I think Indian opinion reached influential people within the diasporic community at the time. Right. I think this has been a long and rich session, and it's probably a good moment to end there. And I'll be seeing you later.
Shall we conclude the session now? If there are
I think
no
this
questions,
is a good moment to
okay,
wrap
sir,
up.
sure. So with this, we conclude the first session and tutorial of day 4 of our Gyan course. A big thank you to Professor Stefan Helgason for his insightful lecture and engaging discussion during the tutorial. We will reconvene in the evening at 8:30 p.m. IST for our next session, titled Looking Back at Apartheid in South Africa. We look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, thank you for your participation and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.